I hope I have something interesting to say. Let's see what you're asking me today.
We'll see. Yeah, I have the same thing happens every time you and I talk, which is a few days before the conversation, I think, well, I'm pretty well versed in this topic. I've watched all of these documentaries. I've read all this stuff online. I've read articles. I follow you on Twitter. And, just a few hours before the conversation, I'll go to your website, read some things up, and I'll be ready. And then I go to your website, start reading it, and it turns out that the rabbit hole goes way deeper than I previously thought. And I end up feeling overwhelmed and like I'm still scratching the surface of this thing. But I think it's worth scratching the surface. And I do have a kind of an angle for this conversation. So let me pitch it to you and you tell me whether it makes sense to you and whether you think it's important. So the reason, there are multiple reasons why the story of Scientology seems to me both interesting and like important, relevant to other spheres of life outside of that particular story. But one dimension in particular that just continues to fascinate me is the way, or even the ways that it allows, on the one hand, for the participants of the church to change their own reality, to shape it, to rewrite their biography, their past, the way they relate to the world. So there's kind of sort of a liberating kind of dynamic there. You feel empowered to change the narrative of your own life. And on the other hand, as you're doing that, there are these structures at play, and the trajectory of a Scientologist's sort of career also enslaves them at the same time. So you are rewriting your own reality, but also Hubbard is gone now, but the beast is still here, is also rewriting your reality and provides a kind of meta-narrative for everybody's individual realities. And it's almost that, let me give you like my simplified, crude version, one lens through which you can look at the story of Scientology that is kind of compelling to me. And you tell me whether it makes sense and whether it's useful to look at the story through that lens. It's something like this. There was this guy, L. Ron Hubbard. At the beginning of the story, he's a writer, fiction writer, very prolific, apparently not very good. I haven't actually read his fiction, but from the reviews that I've seen, not very compelling. Also, apart from like having being into writing stories, he also liked to make stories up about his own life, tell these tall tales about how he was a World War II hero and things like that. Had interests in various sort of psychological or even magical practices. So you have that guy, a young, prolific writer who can't really write a story that will grip you so much that for the time of you, turning the pages, it becomes your reality. But he writes a lot. And then fast forward a couple of decades, he has created this whole social structure, philosophy, model of the psyche, set of practices, organization that, as I said, on the one hand, allows you to change your reality, to start shaping your reality actively. On the other hand, in the most kind of in-your-face example of this dynamic where Scientology starts changing your reality, at OT3, which we talked about in one of our conversations before, it turns out that this whole cosmic biography of yours that you created, you started remembering the time when you were in the womb, and then before that, you were shaping that. But then it turns out that is just one of the stories in this big meta-narrative with the cosmic drama unfolding in the universe. And that story is basically one of those shitty stories that Hubbard started off with writing for magazines. And so to me, it's almost like a story of a writer who found a very strange, roundabout way to make his story not just compelling, but more compelling than any fiction you read if you get to that place, because it becomes the foundational kind of narrative of your reality and of realities of everybody you know, because by that time you probably only know Scientologists. So you're not that all makes sense to you? That seems like a reasonable way to look at it?
Well, yeah, I think you've hit on some very essential truths about the whole situation. I remember one of the first things that comes to my mind when you mention that was some conversations I had with Tori Chrisman almost 20 years ago. Uh, this whole idea that Scientology's appeal, in part, is that people kind of project onto it this idea that this is going to take me to this freedom that I want. This is going to help me create the life that I want. And it is escapist. I mean, a lot of people, I think, are drawn to it because, Scientology itself calls it finding your ruin. You've got some problems in your life. Your career isn't going as well as you'd like. Your relationships aren't good. Your life is just turning out not to be what you were hoping it would be. And Scientology extends this, idea that you can reach your full potential and everything you ever wanted, all your fulfillment, through Scientology. And what the paradox there is that while people are looking for that escapism, they're intrigued by this idea that they actually have lived trillions of years and on other planets, and they're discovering these incredible lives that they've had during that whole process, in which you're trying to fulfill this incredible new narrative about yourself. You're actually being indoctrinated into this heavy set of rules and regulations and restrictions. And I think one of the people that expressed it the best for me, like I said, was Tori Chrisman almost 20 years ago when I was talking to her about it. And I wrote about her in 2001. I think her story is really interesting because she was really one of the first people to come out like live on the internet. She left Scientology while it was happening. It's a very famous incident. And my story about her is still online. It's fascinating. Tori, back then she was known as Tori Bazazian. But she was telling me how, she was essentially a hippie, like a lot of young people that were getting into Scientology in the 60s and 70s. And she was drawn to it by this idea that it was all about free expression and freedom and free speech. Mm-hmm. And that's what she was really after. She wanted to get away from her father was actually a professional football player. So that must have brought some privilege to it. But she still found herself very confined and limited by her, suburban upbringing or whatever. And so like a lot of young people at that time, they were looking for something more important in their lives. And she said when the irony struck her, or when the sort of discordant paradox hit her, was she had got into it in San Francisco, then she went down to Los Angeles, I think, and she walked in, and again, she's looking for this freedom of expression, this way of creating this really great free life. And they've got this picture of Hubbard on the wall that's like 6 feet high, like they're worshiping Mao. And she's like, realized, like, this doesn't make sense. How could we be trying to enrich our lives through freedom when they've got these giant portraits of this guy, who they clearly bow down to? And that was, I think she was one of the first ones that helped me understand that there is that paradox going on, that people inside of it don't even see it. I mean, they buy all the slogans that we make the able more able, for example, is one of their slogans. Another one is that we teach people to think for themselves. And the reality is that whole time that they're absorbing these ideas, their lives are becoming more and more controlled. And it's one of the most oppressive cultures that I've ever run across. I mean, you are liable to be you're liable to be turned into the organization for violating its rules by your own children, right, or by your own parents. I mean, this is like East Germany on steroids. Okay, you can't even think negative thoughts in your own house without risk of your spouse writing you up in what's called a knowledge report and turning you in. So yeah, it's an incredible paradox that they believe that they're achieving some incredible freedom in their lives, when everything about Scientology from the very beginning is all about clamping down control of your life. So the organization has total control over what you do, where your money goes, who you associate with, and ultimately if you run afoul of those rules, you risk everything, your family, your business, your livelihood. So that's one of the great paradoxes. Another thing you mentioned in that I wanted to talk about a little bit was Hubbard's background as a writer, which is also an interesting thing that you brought up. There's actually a new book coming out this month by a man named Alec Navala-Lee. He's a really great guy. I was very fortunate that he came and joined us at our HowdyCon convention this summer in Chicago. We all got to meet him. He's got a really interesting book coming out about John W. Campbell, who ran Astounding Magazine, and his top 3 writers, who were Isaac Asimov, I'm blanking on Robert Heinlein, of course, and then Hubbard, and he really focuses on the 40s, so the period when Campbell really fell for Hubbard's ideas, and it's unsparing. He's dug up some original stuff I haven't seen elsewhere about those early years, the group effort that Dianetics was, which I think a lot of people forget, that it wasn't just Hubbard who put that book together, and that Hubbard, as far as his fiction goes, you were wondering about the quality of it. I have read it. Hubbard's fiction is interesting because it usually was a matter of how much effort he expended. One of Hubbard's flaws was that he was able to write pretty easily and quickly, and so the vast majority of what he wrote was pedestrian, simply because he just didn't care. I mean, you could tell these stories they're repetitive, they're obvious, the characters are out of central casting. I mean, the guy just didn't put much effort into it. And then you run into a piece of writing where he really cared about it and thought about it, and you can really see the difference. So that's the main, I think, criticism of Hubbard is he just wasn't very didn't put much effort into his work. And so most of it is forgettable. But I enjoy going through some of his early stories for hints of what is coming in Scientology. And Alec does some of that in his book. But I think the short story that's really a revelation, and if you haven't seen it, you should take a look at it. In 1940, okay, so a full decade before Dianetics, he wrote a short story called One Was Stubborn. Mm-hmm. And it's incredible. He predicts this future where the United States of America is taken over by evil cults, with evil cult leaders. And the power that this cult has is that they train people how to make matter disappear with their minds. I mean, it's really astounding that there's no question Hubbard had thought deeply about a lot of these issues about, cult thinking and manipulation of matter with the mind. So, and then another thing that I try to point out to people is there's this famous statement he made in 1948 or 1949, just before Dianetics came out. A few different people heard him say it, that, it is no way to make a living as a pulp fiction writer. You're only making a penny a word. If you really want to make $1 million, start your own religion. I don't think there's any question that he did say something like that, but there's something even better, and that is a letter he wrote to Forrest Ackerman in January 1949. So Dianetics was mostly done by that point. He's getting it ready for publication, and Ackerman is this famous figure in science fiction. He was kind of like the super fan of the time, and a literary agent in his own right. He was Hubbard's literary agent, and very close friend with Hubbard, and Hubbard was very open with him in his letters. And in this letter in 1949, he said that, with this book, you can rape women without them knowing it. You can hypnotize people to sell them things. And he said, and I don't know if I'm going to destroy the Catholic Church or just start my own. He said that in 1949. That's a very
interesting way of putting it. Yeah.
So, I don't think there's any question that he had these things in mind. I don't know that he had it all planned out, because the first couple of years after Dianetics came out, he did sell it as a science. And people like John Campbell were taken in. They thought this really was a science to affect the human mind. It wasn't until 1953, after he'd been through bankruptcy and things were really struggling, that Hubbard told a follower of hers that, we should try the religion angle. So that's I think he had it in mind originally, but he didn't really become determined to do it until 53.
Mm-hmm. So what I want to do, or try to do, is to, I was going through, you have on the side, you have the series Up the Bridge, where an ex-Scientologist kind of guides the readers and you as the interviewer
Right.
through the trajectory of a Scientologist, what do you want to call it, spiritual career.
Yeah.
And I want to pause on some things there and just to see what tools are at use there to, as I say, on the one hand, allow the participant to shape their reality, and at the same time, how slowly they become completely engrossed into this, totalitarian kind of structure and the vision of the world. But maybe before we go there, even, so you said Dianetics at first was a group effort. And I think in one of our early conversations, you mentioned a little bit about Hubbard's own kind of earlier excursions into, he was a hypnotist, he was into Aleister Crowley, he was doing these tapes where he would like kind of self-program himself for success or whatever. So is there like a starting point? What is the earliest thing he does for himself to try to actively change his own reality and reshape his own life?
Well, I mean, he was a very ambitious young man. I mean, right from the very beginning, I mean, even as a teenager, he was very good at telling tall tales and manipulating people. In 1927, when he was 16, he had gone to the Far East because his father had been, as it was a Navy lieutenant, he was stationed in Guam, and he had gone out there with his mother, and he came back and he just spun these tall tales for the newspaper in Montana, where he was a high school student, and they bought it. And I think he realized that he had that gift, that he could convince people of things that, and there was a basis of truth to what he was saying. He genuinely had been to these places in Japan and China and the Philippines and Guam, but he always exaggerated things for effect and to make himself look like more of an expert. He would tell these tall tales about poisonous snakes and buried gold, and he loved the way people just ate it up. And I think so from a very early age, he understood that he had a talent for making a future for himself based on his ability to persuade people of things that he was embellishing. That pattern was set very early. And he kept falling upwards. I mean, he had a Navy lieutenant for a father who, after he flunked out of high school, got him into a crammer, which it's basically a prep school to get him into college. He got into college, he flunked out of that, but he still, made connections and stuff. So he was always, he failed high school, he failed college, but he always found a way, like I said, to kind of fail upwards. And he had a lot of talent for storytelling. And then in the 30s, after college, he started writing for the magazines. And he like I said, his talent was speed. I mean, this was the Depression, and people were struggling to make a living. And at that time, even though these pulp magazines only cost a nickel at the newsstand, they actually paid pretty well to writers, and you could make a living selling short stories as long as you wrote enough of them. And again, that was his talent. So he was sending out stories every day to Western magazines, romance magazines, detective magazines. Science fiction was only one of his interests, and in fact, I think his son mentioned that it was not his favorite. Science fiction kind of didn't interest him. He actually said he didn't like the gadgets. He liked concepts of science fiction and time travel and stuff like that, but he really didn't. He never has a lot of spaceships that he describes and things like that. It's all kind of hand waved. So but he wrote for everybody. Nibs, his son, said there were times when he could pick up a magazine on the newsstand, and Ron would use multiple pseudonyms, right, pen names. And Nibs said that his dad could pick up a magazine and point to every article in that issue, and he had written them all. That's how fast. That was his number one talent, was that he wrote so many short stories. He was able to make a living in the depths of the Great Depression. So you got to give him credit for that. But the quality, you know, nobody today is really, except the Church of Scientology, is really honoring and you know, talking about the quality of L. Ron Hubbard's fiction writing.
What about these, I don't know what you call them, psycho practices, psychological?
Yeah. So, and then along that, so you asked for kind of a landmark, kind of a milestone. So he, you know, like I said, he was always sort of working on his own legend, always. You know, yes, his mother took him to Asia to see his dad. They came back. And they saw some interesting sights, and he kept a diary. We know what they actually saw. But then when he told people about it, he was on this magical spiritual tour, and he was hanging out with shamans and stuff. I mean, it's just all nonsense, but it's the way he liked to pump up his myth. And so he was doing that from a young age. And then a key moment is in the 30s, he had married his first wife by 32 or 33, I'm forgetting now. And they had Nibs and Katie, their son and a daughter. And then he got going on the fiction writing. He was doing well. He was going to New York. The wife and kids were back in Washington State. And then she said that at some point in about 38 or something, before the war, he wrote this letter to her, admitting to her that his goal was, as he put it, to smash his name into history. And that same period, 38, is when he had a kind of a mystical experience. He had a tooth problem and went to the dentist, and they put him out for the procedure. And while he was under sedation, he had this vision where he basically went to heaven or somewhere and saw all of the world's knowledge laid out in front of him. And then he came back and realized that he now had this incredible vision that because he was able to come back, he now was going to be the conduit of the world's wisdom or whatever. So this was a very, very big moment for him. He and again, he writes the letter at that time. He now knows what his life work is. He's going to smash his name into history. And this is when he actually begins writing the work that 12 years later will eventually become Dianetics. At that time, he called it Excalibur, and he had his great insight. And Scientologists to this day will tell you that this is actually a great insight. But his great insight was that the meaning of life was to survive.
Right.
Which, you know, wow, what an insight, right? So, but to him, this was like earth-shaking knowledge. And so that was kind of what was informed in that first manuscript, Excalibur, which he had this great gimmick. He would tell people that he'd written this incredible book of human knowledge, but he couldn't show it to anybody because the first dozen people he showed it to, half of them killed themselves, right? So that's how he built up excitement, just the same way, you know, Mark Twain and in Huckle Finn talks about, you know, the trouble begins at 8 p.m. You know, I mean, there's a way. He was a very good salesman of his own story. And so he convinced people that this manuscript was too dangerous to show anybody. I have seen descriptions of it, and it's clear that it's basically just a portion of what eventually became Dianetics, which of course anybody could read and nobody commits suicide. You might, I can imagine people going to sleep reading Dianetics, but I don't imagine people jumping off a cliff. So by 38, I think he's got this image that he's going to somehow shake up the world through ideas. Then the war comes, and he, you know, for him, the war was this amazing opportunity. Guys like Hubbard really were looking forward to, you know, having this opportunity to have this heroic experience. And then it was a disaster. World War II was just basically a disaster for him. He got into the Navy. He became a lieutenant. He was very quickly. He was given command of a ship that was being refitted in Boston Harbor. He lost that command after one day. It was such a disaster, and his crew hated him so much, they took him off of that. He then went out west and became the commander of a boat that was a sub chaser that had depth charges. And famously, after he took command of that ship just off the coast of Oregon, he engaged in this 35-hour battle with what he claimed were 2 Japanese submarines, but the Navy itself concluded that he was shooting at a log and a magnetic deposit on the seafloor. And from there, he sailed south down the coast, the West Coast, until they got near Mexico, and he opened fire on a Mexican island for target practice, which caused an international incident, and then he was removed from that command. And so by the time the war ended, he was in a hospital on the West Coast, and he was hospitalized for hemorrhoids and pink eye. And we have the records. There's no question about this. But he told people that he'd been machine gunned in Java, and that he had survived being in an open raft in the ocean for a month. I mean, just he invented all these incredible stories about how heroic World War II was for him. But so after the war, then he got back to this idea that he was going. Then he got involved with Parsons and Crowley and Crowley. I'm sorry, Crowley is how you say it correctly. Crowley was in England. He never met Crowley, but they were following Crowley's teachings, and got into this sex magic stuff. And then finally, in 1950, he came out with this book that really he'd sort of been thinking about for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there is at least a basis. Like, it's not all just making things up. It's part of there's some core in Dianetics that he used for himself. He was doing these different practices. And I guess throughout then the Scientology career, he was also like doing auditing on himself and stuff, right? So it's not, there's a part of it that is important and relevant to himself, and he's using that for his own.
Well, he claimed that he had been machine gunned and he was blind, and that's why he was in the hospital at the end of the war. And then he hit upon these techniques which had cured him. And I mean, even Tommy Davis, as recently as 2010, had told Lawrence Wright that, this is the story that he healed himself of his war wounds with this thing that became Dianetics, which is the basis for everything the Church of Scientology is about. And if that story isn't true, then Scientology isn't true. Well, then Lawrence Wright got the actual military records and showed there was no truth to the story at all. So, this was a guy who was a skilled stage hypnotist who saw himself as the master of other people, master of men, who actually said to himself in those 1940s affirmations, they're called, that he was going to enslave other people. And he came up with this parlor trick where you concentrate to the point of trance and convince yourself that you are removing these memories. And initially it was just that you were somehow remembering what had happened to you in the womb. But then a few years later, when they developed Scientology, you're going back thousands, millions, billions of years to remember, quote, remember what happened to you on other planets and other, eras. So, this was a stage hypnotist to convince people that they were going through these activities. And he backed it up with these incredibly repetitive, time-intensive, exhausting activities that people go through called training routines. And, outside experts will look at TR0, which are basically staring exercises, and some of these other exercises where you're putting people through motions, repetitive motions, and then just regular auditing where you're questioning people for hours and days. Outside experts take one look at that and say, well, they're just putting you in a trance. So you're suggestible, and so you'll say anything. You'll dream up anything. It's funny because even ex-Scientologists who have left and are very critical of David Miscavige, the current leader, and everything, not all of them will. It takes a while before they'll say to you, yeah, those quote memories I had from 10 million years ago on another planet, I guess I dreamed those up. I mean, some of them are aware of it at the time. That's what's really amazing, man, is that they will tell you that, yeah, I kind of knew at the time that I was just sort of dreaming it up. But by that time, they've got you on this conveyor belt. Another thing that's just really powerful about Scientology that Hubbard should get credit for is, as the way some of us say today, he gamified it, right? Mm-hmm. So many people have pointed out how much Scientology is like a role-playing game. And it is. You're always trying to get that next level. And Paul Haggis pointed this out in Going Clear. He was saying, initially you go through these exercises and they're really interesting because, they do train you to have more concentration and to be able to deal with any kind of interruptions. I mean, I think it's part of the. I think it's definitely part of the hypnotism. But you know, people enjoy that. And then he said, but so the next couple levels didn't work so well. But then by that time, you want to. How can you stop? You're on. You know, you're on grade 2. You know, there's a grade 3. How can you stop now? So very, very clever the way he gamified it that way and made it so that you're always trying to. You're always around people that are several levels higher than you. And you don't like feeling that feeling of inferiority. You want to be on their level with them. And also, you assume they have some kind of insight or perhaps superpower that they're hiding from you, and you need to get to their level to get that. And that people chase that for decades. Yep. I mean, they'll spend and millions of dollars so they can finally say, I've been to OT8, I've been to the top. But the other smart thing that Hubbard put into it is you can't say anything about it. You're not supposed to talk about anything that happened in your sessions with anybody else. The reason why that's so smart is that virtually everyone who goes through this and goes through this past life therapy ends up deciding that they were Jesus Christ, or they were Julius Caesar, or they were Joan of Arc. And the problem is, if they were allowed to discuss it with each other, they'd realize that it's all nonsense. But they think they're having this incredible experience. Oh my, I'm Jesus Christ and nobody knows it. You know, wow, what a feeling. So again, that's part of the control. It's part of the manipulation, and it's just shot through the whole organization.
Yeah, a few things came to mind while you were talking. One is, I do want to, how should I put it? I don't want to like make too much fun of people who say, you know, it's like looking from the outside in. It's easy to say, how could you believe in this? How could you think that those past lives that you dreamed up were real? And that element is like, this is, I think one of the major strengths of Scientology as the system is it's all based on experience. You go through these trainings and these practices, and there's a whole vocabulary that I've written somewhere here. There's a dozen of different terms for what it is that they do. But if it's your experience, if you know you were asked, I think you brought up in one of our earlier conversation, there's some training where you're asked a question, something like, where do you feel comfortable, where do you feel safe, 300 times in a row.
Right.
When like those, you give answers, and those are your answers. You were trying to be sincere, and you were trying to be attentive to what thoughts bubble up, and many of these thoughts would surprise you. You didn't expect to say something like what do you end up saying, and then you're left with that. That was your direct experience. Something inside you did, you know, mention the past life of being on a different planet and being, you know, decapitated or something. And that's difficult to dismiss when it's not something that you read. It's not something that somebody else told you, but it came from you. That is, you know, that can be powerful.
Well, and what also makes it powerful is this e-meter. You know, they're convinced that, you know, this thing I just quote remembered from 10 million years ago sounds kind of crazy. I mean, I was the overlord of a prison planet, and I was committing genocide and killing people by the millions. That's kind of disturbing and crazy. But look, the machine says it's true. And that's part of what cements it for them is, well, the machine says it's true. They have no idea that this machine is complete crock, you know, that, you know, it's compromised by the fact that you hold these cans. Nobody holds anything perfectly still. There's always going to be an element of that signal being corrupted by the fact that you change your grip. The e-meter is garbage, but they are convinced that it's infallible. And so this crazy memory they've had, suddenly it's like, well, the machine says it's real, so it's real. It's not until they come out much later that they realize, yeah, I guess that wasn't real. I agree with you. I agree and disagree. I always try to be sympathetic to people telling me their stories about Scientology. You know, obviously some of them grow up in it. They don't really know anything else. Other people, they're always brought in at a vulnerable moment, like they've lost a job or they've lost a relationship. Scientology is very good at manipulating them, and they're also they're very smart in the way they sort of appeal to reason and convince you Hubbard was very, very smart in setting it up so that you convince yourself that it's real. You're not accepting things from Hubbard on faith. He's telling you, well, if we ask you these questions and this machine operates in a certain way, then what that indicates is X, Y, and Z. And so then you go through it and realize, wow, that must be true. And so they're very manipulative, and you don't realize it when you're going in. So I do try to be sympathetic. But I do have to say, though, is that ex-Scientologists also need to own a little bit of their gullibility. I remember I was watching Leah Remini's show last season, and there was a fantastic episode she had with her mother where they basically revealed what's in OT8, which has never been done on television before. It was a fantastic episode. But her mom, Vicky, who's wonderful, Vicky said something great. They were asking her why she first got into Scientology, and I guess she had worked in the medical field or something. She was a nurse, or she had wanted to or something in her life. And what impressed her was she had picked up this, $3 book of Dianetics, and it promised a future with no illness. And she was just, that's so great. And so I got into it, and I thought to myself, wait a minute. So a $3 paperback tells you it has the answers to a future with no illness, and you bought it? I mean, at some point, ex-Scientologists need to own up to the fact that that should not have convinced you of anything. That should not have drawn you into anything. I mean, so I try to look at it from both sides. I totally sympathetic to Scientologists that smart people can be brought into this thing. But I also look at you just look at the way Scientology, read Dianetics. I can't, if you read Dianetics and you're convinced of anything, I mean, it's just garbage. One of the first reviews, it might have been Scientific American, I'm not sure, 1950, said there are more claims and less evidence in this book than anything that's been put on paper, and it's true. So, they are very good at manipulating people, but people have to admit that often we are easy to manipulate. All of us are, me too. Yeah. And that's why Scientology works. But only on a small number of people. We got to keep in mind, Scientology only ever appeals to a very small minority of people.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get into this, the practices. Just one quick aside before that. You mentioned this mystical experience that Hubbard had, and I either didn't know about it or forgot about it. Now that you said it, are you by any chance a Philip K. Dick fan? This sounds very similar to what he had gone through with also, I think, a tooth surgery.
He had a fugue state. Absolutely, no question. Philip K. Dick went through the same kind of thing. You're right. And I don't know, with Hubbard, he was under sedation. I mean, what, okay, so he had a vision. I mean, I don't think that it's all that miraculous or anything. It's not so much that he had a vision under sedation. It's that he then decided that there was a reality to it, and that he had basically been anointed this great, conduit of knowledge to the world. That's the part where you're like, well, no, you just, had kind of a strange trip under, an anesthetic,
I would make the same point that I just said about, Scientologists, like the power of the direct experience. As a person who's done quite a bit of psychedelics, you said it's weird that Scientologists present this, the goal of life is to survive, as an epiphany. It seems like a pretty obvious thing. But
I'll tell you what,
if you experience that that you have hallucinations and you have some sort of a world knowledge imparted on you, that might have more weight to it than if you just thought about it while reading the Theory of Evolution.
Well, I tell you what, if Philip K. Dick had started a church, I might want to belong to it. I mean, there's a real writer, and I think he had a more sort of I'm much more sympathetic to his point of his ideas about humanity than Hubbard's. But anyway, it's good to see his books being turned into movies now. It's great.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so let's try to go into these practices, what Scientologists call tech. And what I want to attempt is to pause everyone once in a while and appreciate what happens here, what forces are starting to work on a person, as we talked about, this in this paradoxical manner of both giving you some power in authoring your own life, but also enslaving you at the same time.
Right.
So,
well, yeah, that series, I'm really glad we got to maybe do that series. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe longer. And I was very fortunate to partner with Claire Headley on that for the most part, but also brought in Bruce Hines near the end. And Claire was fantastic. I mean, one of the things we were looking at the lower levels. So one of the first things you do are these training routines, very repetitive. They're staring exercises essentially. And then there are these word exercises you go through. What Claire was saying in these early exercises, like with study tech, so they convince you that you've been studying wrong. And the key to everything is looking up words in dictionaries.
I thought that was brilliant.
All of your problems are based on the fact that you skip past words you don't understand. So you need to look things up in dictionaries, and then you need to model them in clay. The 3 concepts of study tech are the misunderstood word, going up a gradient, and having mass. So misunderstanding a word, you need to constantly use dictionary, and in a way that's just obsessive and really counterproductive.
Can you pause on that and give me an example? Do I imagine it correctly? You're like, right, look up a word, then you look up the words and the definition of that word, and then you look up.
They use it as punishment. I mean, they'll tell a child, okay, you misbehaved, go look up all the definitions of the word to and so it becomes, it's really kind of sick the way they do it. There's nothing wrong with looking things up in a dictionary, but like all things in Scientology, they take it to such an extreme that it really slows down. Actual educators that have looked at this say that it's not really a very smart way to learn. Second of all is the idea of gradient, that you can't learn too quickly. You have to learn in steps, which again sounds reasonable, but they always take it to an extreme. And then finally, that you learn best through mass, which is that you not only read about concepts, but you model them in clay so that you have an object. And again, they take this to ridiculous extremes. I mean, you should see some of the models that they make people do in clay. So you're doing all this, and again, none of it sounds too objectionable, but what Claire pointed out is through all of this, in the staring exercises, the word exercises, the study tech, everything is intended to convince you that Scientology's ideas are the only ideas with validity. Mm-hmm. And you are replacing whatever values you had that you brought to Scientology. You were replacing them with ultimately what's a policy called keeping Scientology working. And this becomes the single most important policy in your life. And she says, as you're going through these basic exercises, it may not seem like you're radically turning over the way you think, but you are. And the whole point is about control and manipulation until ultimately you become completely dedicated to Scientology at the expense of everything else. So she says there is no innocent exercise in Scientology, even at the lowest levels. It's all intended to create that indoctrination and control.
I thought this word thing was fascinating and brilliant in a sinister kind of way. Again, part of the reason learning about Scientology is so interesting to me is because, again, looking outside in, most people feel this is crazy. How do you even, how do you not notice that you're in a situation when you're in a cult? But at the same time, in the structure, you see so many dynamics that you can then find in political groups, in other religious groups, in movements, ideologies, and all of that. And I think that's valuable. When you see something that you very quickly dismiss as insane, and then you notice the same thing in something that you might be a part of or somebody you know might be a part of, that's valuable. That gives you a little insight. And the word thing was seemed like a good example of that to me, because so one thing is this constant looking things up. If something's not working, or if you have some trouble understanding the thing, you need to understand the concepts deeper and look words up and then look words within those definitions up. And then in parallel to that, there's just going through this Up the Bridge series, there's so much new vocabulary. There's so many terms.
I was just going to mention that, right?
That you learn and you assimilate, and then I assume you look them up a whole lot, and then it's this idea: the limits of my language are the limits of my world, right? So what you're doing here is you're adopting a new language, and there's this repetitive, almost trance-inducing study-like practice of making sure that language really is integrated into the very way you think about things. And once you have that, you don't, like, before you even start making an argument, before you even start thinking about things, you already have the words and the categories with which you're going to build that argument, and those are already put you in the context of this like Scientology thinking.
Yeah.
But again, the same thing can be found in political ideologies. If you read Marx and you for the first time see the world as, oh, there are classes and there's a struggle between classes, and that's how we look at the historical process, if that becomes, it can be enriching if that's like an additional perspective that you have. It's another language you've learned. But if it becomes the sole language that you use, and I mean, Scientology really goes into at lengths to make sure that their framework is the only framework that you use, then you become enslaved in this thing before you even start using it to build a narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a part of the tribalism is that, as you're going through Scientology, you're not only looking up words, but you're adopting their words. And Hubbard had, like all leaders of these kind of groups, had invented a lot of words and terms that you are then obliged to learn and use. And sometimes it's really fun when you're talking to ex-Scientologists and they've been out of the church for 20 years and they'll just come out with a sentence that's nothing but Scientologese. It's really hard to let go of that language once they learn it. These are real basic concepts about how to learn, how to think, how to respond to people, what ideas are worth pursuing, which ones aren't. I mean, it really is a trap. It's a trap of thinking. It's a way of shutting down anything that doesn't, follow their guidelines, and it's seductive too. I use Scientology terms all the time. I find them. I mean, for my purposes, they're fun and funny. But
which terms do you use?
Oh, I'm always using words like confront and cognite and interpolate and theta. I'm always using their terms, and feedy weedy, I'll call somebody. So it's some of them are useful, some of them are fun, but not in the context that Scientology uses them. I mean, Scientology's using them as a way to define the debate, shut down objections, and really convince people that they're seeing things only in a Scientology way. And it's so well enshrined in that policy, keeping Scientology working, KSW. That's the one that they have to memorize and repeat. And it's the idea that, not only has Hubbard come up with these ideas and these processes, but you can only do it the way Hubbard designed it. See, that's another thing that's part of Scientology history it's very interesting to look into, is that from the very beginning, remember, Hubbard claimed it was a science. And the nature of science is that if a scientist makes a discovery, another scientist can investigate it on their own and replicate the results. Because a scientific discovery is not owned by the scientist. It's a physical fact that other people can then also find for themselves. And so from the beginning, when Hubbard was saying that this was a science, people took him up on that and said, okay, he's come up with these ideas about the human mind. Now I'm going to work on those ideas and advance them, which is what you do when somebody has a biological discovery or a physical sciences discovery, is that somebody else can come along and say, okay, that's understood. Now let's go even farther. That drove Hubbard crazy because it's not a science. It's his own little parlor trick. And it drove him crazy that other people would then try to refine it. And so he said from the very beginning, the thing that drove him more crazy than anything else in the early days were these splinter groups. and people that were saying, okay, thanks Hubbard for these ideas. Now we're taking it in our own direction. Oh, that just drove him mad. And so a lot of the early security policies were put in place to crack down on these other groups. And the word he came up with them were squirrels. If you weren't following Hubbard technology to the letter, the way he invented it, you were a squirrel, and you were squirreling the technology. And they use that today. It's like the worst thing you can call a Scientologist can call somebody else is to call them a squirrel. So they believe in this just rigid. It's a fundamentalist group, is what it is. It's among the most fundamentalist groups you will ever find. They literally can't change what Hubbard said 60 years ago. Now, yes, David Miscavige is making some changes in ways that it's driving some people away because they're so dedicated to the way Hubbard did things. But essentially, Scientology today is still trying to deliver what they call standard tech standardly at his special orgs. So and it all comes back to language. It all comes back to exactly the way you describe things, how you ask the questions, how people answer. They say they're freeing you, but they're really putting you to a straitjacket, and it's a straitjacket of language.
Let's go through these earlier. You mentioned a bunch of times now the staring context. So it's like the first few trainings that you get. Correct me if I misremember something. There's first you need to learn how to just be there comfortably. So just sit and be okay with that. When
you go into a Scientology facility, you'll often see these pairs of chairs set down facing each other with only a few feet between them. This is a very standard feature in Scientology because the first exercise you do, TR0, is the two people sit down facing each other and just be, just be there. And then it becomes a staring contest where you're staring at the other person and you can't flinch. And I mean, we're talking hours. They spend hours. And if you are staring at the other person and you flinch, then you have to start over again. Then it moves on to, okay, it's not just enough just to sit there. It's not just enough to sit there and stare at somebody. Now the other person is actively going to be trying to make you flinch. They're going to yell at you. They're going to insult you. This is called bull baiting. And again, you're just trying to just sit still. You've already gone through, countless hours of the idea of just slowing down and sitting and not moving. Now you're getting all this, yelled at you and screamed at you. And so you're trying to take that ability and extend it to where people could do anything in front of you and you're not going to move a muscle. Now, some people would say this is a really good skill to have. If you're working in a tough environment, the boss is yelling at you, it's really good just to be able to just sort of take it and not scream back at your boss, right? And there's definitely some, something to that this is a good sort of skill to have. On the other hand, you're producing somebody who can do this stare and never move a muscle, which is very characteristic of Scientologists.
Right.
And some people would say that's a cult stare. But, you're making it so people are very manipulable, very suggestible. And that's what's going on in these early exercises. And they spend so much time at it, and they have to come. The other thing that surprised me when I was going through these with Claire was that when you get to the higher levels, whatever it is, whether it's the grades or the OTs or anything, the first thing you have to do is go back to the beginning and do everything all over again. I mean, you have to keep doing the personality test. You have to keep doing the TRs. You have to keep doing all these different processes. Reread Dianetics again. I mean, over and over and over and over. And so you can see why people just become this, like, so completely programmed by Scientology thinking. It's the repetition. I don't know how they do it. It's so boring. But I guess that it kind of puts you into sort of this trance state where you're very suggestible.
This bull baiting thing seemed to me like one of the examples of this kind of paradoxical dynamic going on. Because on the one hand, you're learning to not be affected by anything that's happening around. So it's a kind of a source of strength. Once you go through these attempts to abuse you or to insult you, then you can take anything. You kind of become stronger. At the same time, you're learning to allow the other person to do whatever to you. And there's an example in this particular, when Claire was telling her story. I mean, this is a whole other issue with children. She was born into Scientology, and she's going through these trainings as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old. And in that particular thing with bull baiting, she said that it was really uncomfortable when a grown man started unbuttoning her shirt. And so at that moment, yeah, you're learning to take whatever and you're strong, or are you allowing the other person to do anything that because you're, developing it's a Scientologist in this case, but I mean, I've seen that. I haven't been myself to these things, but there are many different groups that propose to teach you how to be more effective. And this kind of dynamic where they try to push your buttons and you're supposed to learn to not react to that, that's pretty common there.
It is. I mean, think about the military. I mean, the military needs somebody who can be calm and collected and remember their training and know what to do in the middle of a battlefield with bullets flying around and explosions going off. So, of course, the military is also interested in this kind of conditioning to just put everything out of your mind, follow your program, do what you're supposed to do. I think a lot of organizations value this kind of training, and it's something that I think a lot of them do in one form or another. And in Scientology, it's the first thing you do is you just learn to empty your mind and just take that abuse. And then it becomes very valuable later on when they get you into the Sea Org. Mm-hmm. And you're working, 13, 14 hours a day for pennies an hour. You may go years without having a day off or seeing anybody from your family or seeing any friends. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they've suddenly decided you've got to dump the last 6 hours of work and do something from scratch. And you're tired and you're hungry and your life is, so grim. And that TR kicks in and you just like, yes, sir. That's what they're counting on. That's where the training is invaluable to them, is that they know no matter what you ask that Sea Org person, no matter how miserable you've made them, no matter how much crap you've thrown at them, they're just going to look at you and acknowledge and say, yes, sir. And that's what you want. So, and then they pride themselves on it. That's the other thing I always find fascinating is that when I talk to former Sea Org officers, they talk about how they're on their last nerve and they're totally worn out and something's going on, and that's when the others will sort of like, what are you, a dilettante? Can't you keep up? I mean, they enforce it among themselves. If you see somebody breaking down who can't handle it, is losing their discipline, is complaining, then the others heap all kinds of abuse on them. Like, where's your training? Where's your TRs? So yeah, some people will tell you that, well, I only went through the beginning parts and I thought it was really good and I really liked the exercises and it helped me be better in communication. I don't think they always understand that was part of this conditioning that allows them to create these people who can work for them around the clock and deny themselves, deny their families. That's what Scientology relies on. And it begins from day one in learning to stare.
What about, you just mentioned communication. What about this business of, I didn't totally understand this, saying things over and over again in a certain way, like you're flunked, quote unquote flunked, if you say something unnaturally, but you're just repeating phrases like from Alice in the Wonderland or something like that.
Again, it's part of that conditioning that you have to carry out a command the way it's supposed to be carried out. And there's no varying. So
is there a correct way of saying a phrase from Alice in Wonderland? How do you find out the right way to say it?
Whether it's Alice in Wonderland, I mean, that's just training so that when you're carrying out Hubbard's commands, they want them carried out perfectly. So, I mean, I remember I was talking to, I think it was Serge Gill, and he was telling me about one exercise he went through. It just sounded mindless. It had to do with the E-meter. And that it was just that you had to set up an E-meter in a particular way, describe the different components, and turn it on and turn it off or whatever. And that's it. There was no actual processing, but that you just described the e-meter and took it out of its box. It was just really basic stuff. And he said it was incredibly difficult because they would have you do it and do it and do it. And if you did the slightest thing out of order, flunk, start over again. And I asked him, I said, what was the point of that? And he said, oh, so that you're really familiar with the machine. I'm thinking, come on, really familiar with the machine? It takes 5 minutes to be familiar with that machine. There's only like 3 different knobs on it. It's clearly that, again, it's part of this incredible control that they want sunk into your mind. And that's why it's so hard. You know, I think even a lot of Scientologists don't realize this. They'll tell me they've been out for a decade and they're still having a hard time, you know, getting that way of thinking out of their minds and trying to readapt to the society at large. And I explained to them, I said, you went through hundreds and hundreds of hours of processing. Go touch that wall, pick up this bottle. How heavy is that book? Stare into my eyes. Don't flinch. I mean, they spend hundreds and hundreds of hours going through these manipulative exercises that just really like brand on your brain these ways of thinking and short-circuiting your intellect. And so, you know, it does take years and years afterwards for them to realize, you know, I can just relax today. I don't have to get anything done. I can read a book for pleasure. That really can put a whammy on people. And I try to, you know, be sympathetic that you know, somebody who's not been long out of Scientology will still have that worldview and still use that language for a long time.
There's a question that I've been meaning to ask you in the previous conversations too. Something that always confused me in these documentaries that I watched with interviews with ex-Scientologists, where they would explain how difficult it is to start their life over after they leave the cult. And, you know, it makes perfect sense that would be very difficult. Your whole life was in this organization. All of your personal connections are there. You worked probably for that organization. You are either don't have any money or are in debt because you have all of these Dianetics books lying around that you need to sell. And then you start from scratch with nothing, you know, to lean on. But all of these interviews seem to be taking place in good houses with there is not a commentary from the documentary maker about what their life, how they actually did put their life together. And they seem to be doing okay. They seem to be, you know, living pretty comfortably. And it almost makes me like maybe that training did help when they needed to find a job afterwards.
Well, there's no question that people who come out of the Sea Org are facing a daunting challenge of readapting the modern world. But what they do not need training on at that point is how to work long hours. I mean, Sea Org members, they have been trained just to deny themselves and work incredible hours. That question often comes up, you know, especially with Leah's show. That, you know, Leah's show always seems to these interviews seem to take place in really nice homes. And, well, what are they complaining about? They obviously came out and they were fine. Well, you have to keep in mind that this is a television show, and they're, you know, I remember Tom DeVaught was saying, hey, they interviewed me at my tiny apartment. You know, nobody seemed to notice that I lived in this tiny apartment. I wasn't doing too good. And also, you know, we're just seeing a few people, most of them have done very well. I mean, one of the great stories is Mark and Claire Headley. They came out, they had nothing. They had not been to school. They had no connections. But Mark had worked in audiovisual technology in Scientology, and Claire had done financial stuff, and they were former Sea Org members, so they knew how to work. And they told me the story. It was great. I mean, Claire just walked down to the closest diner and just said, do you have, you know, work? No, but maybe the one next door. I mean, she was just like, whatever. She got a hostess job and then a waitress job. And then she was doing the books for the restaurant. And then ultimately she was able to open her own, you know, tax preparing business. I mean, so industrious, amazing. Mark, a similar story. He just took anything he could get in the technology field and worked his way up. And now he's got his own business. So they just know how to work. They work very hard. They've done very well. But I know other people in Scientology that have come out and they've struggled, and they have not been featured on Leah Remini's show. And some of these people lead really marginal lives. So I would just say that part of what's going on there is a selection process for television. And it's not necessarily a reflection of how people come out. People come out of Scientology and they struggle. Mm-hmm. They struggle and they continue to struggle. But even so, even if somebody leaves Scientology and then becomes a success, it doesn't change the fact that they were abused and neglected while they were in Scientology. So I would say listen to them, even if they seem to be doing well now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not dismissing their struggle at all. It's just always been confusing to me.
Well, and then also keep in mind that I remember last year in season 2, there was a couple of young women from out of the country. And so they rented a really nice home to interview them in, and it had nothing to do with them. So just keep that in mind too, that, you know, it's a choice that Leah's producers are making about how, you know, where they want to film. And so it's not necessarily reflecting their what they've been through.
Right. Okay. So another thing that starts early in the career and then becomes more pronounced and more sinister as you go deeper is I forget like which part of the bridge thing it starts first, but very early on, you're told that there are people who are, first they're called antisocial personalities. And you need to identify them by a certain list of characteristics, find them in your lives, and first just write an essay about these people. And then as you continue, that becomes a suppressive person, which is sort of like the enemy of the state was in the Soviet Union, and here you have the enemy of the church that you can't talk to, that is evil incarnate.
Right.
That also, I want to just, I'm trying to make these connections between Scientology and the outside world. That also I see sometimes in like somebody goes into therapy and they find out that there are toxic relationships and codependent relationships, which there are people, communication with which or relationship with which could be harmful to you, but sometimes you see, like I know this girl who learned about toxic relationships and that she needs to get rid of these, bad influences in her life and cut those people off. And then one by one, she cut everybody off because every relationship is toxic. Because if there's difficulty in a relationship, that person must be what do you call antisocial personality in Scientology. So how does that evolve?
Well, in Scientology, it often begins with a cold. Hubbard
taking everything to an extreme, huh?
I know. I mean, Hubbard tried to convince them that every illness was psychosomatic. So when you literally get just a cold, you will be asked who is making you sick. They assume that there's some enemy of the church that you are connected to. And I've talked to so many Scientologists that said that they got a cold and they had to sit down and write out a knowledge report about who was making them ill, that there must be somebody in their life that's a potential trouble source or an SP, a suppressive person. And they really believe that there's this enemy of the church out there and your association with them is causing you literally to be ill. And so it's what it's really all about is this constant security force and constant vigilance about, you need to remove everyone from your life who's not, once again, keeping Scientology working. That's always the policy that gets cited. So who is it in your life? Maybe somebody, maybe a relative has decided not to go to Scientology anymore. And maybe they're watching Going Clear and maybe they've told you about it. You need to turn that person in. They need to be declared a suppressive person, an enemy of the church. Or if it's not, or maybe they're connected to somebody who's an SP and your relative is what's called a potential trouble source. That's somebody who's not an SP themselves, but is connected to an SP. So somebody in your life has made you PTS, made you a potential trouble source, and it's reflected in the fact that you got a runny nose. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. But really, what it is, it's just part of the control mechanism. And I've pointed out so many times, Scientology is a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. You are constantly looking for ways to turn in your relatives, your spouse, your children, because if you don't turn them in, they're going to turn you in, and you need to get them interrogated. And these interrogations cost thousands of dollars. So
Right,
one of the best things we have on the website, and we're going to have a new version of it soon at the Underground Bunker, so keep an eye out for it. Truly remarkable recording. And none of the TV documentaries have taken advantage of it. I don't know why. But there's a woman in Colorado by the name of Sylvia DeWall, and at the time she was living in Florida. And she went through these interrogations and admitted to some crimes. Crimes like watching Leah Remini on Dancing with the Stars and watching Lawrence Wright be interviewed on television. These were high crimes in the minds of Scientologists. And so we have this audio recording of her actually being declared a suppressive person by this young ethics officer who's just, his staring TRs are down perfect. She even says something about it. Your TRs are great, buddy. Because she's bringing up to him, I mean, it's audio, so you can't see it, but you can hear her describing the fact that, okay, now that you're declaring me a suppressive person because I dared to watch Leah Remini on TV, now she's going to get kicked out of the church. Her husband, who's a very active member, will be pressured to divorce her. And then the children will have to choose sides. And then their business caters to Scientologists. They're going to lose the business. All of these dominoes fall simply because you watch something on television you're not supposed to watch. That's the level of control and snitching and interrogation there is in the Church of Scientology, and everyone is super paranoid about it all the time. You have to be, because it costs you so much money. Not only, even if she had not been kicked out, she'd have to pay thousands of dollars for the interrogation. And then, and then to convince Scientology that you're back on track, the only way you can convince them of that is to spend another 20 grand on some more courses. Then they're convinced, oh, okay, great. So you're back on lines. So, it's really Orwellian, East German Stasi. I mean, however you want to describe it, as far as the lives these poor people lead, where they're constantly looking over their shoulder at their own family members. Right. I remember talking to a guy, he was in his 70s, and he had made a very good living for quite a few years delivering the low-level courses out of his own home. That was kind of the original model, was you could have franchises and people would run Dianetics facilities out of their own house, and you could make a really good amount of money and then send the person on up the bridge down to the local org. Well, Miscavige has systematically dismantled that over the last 20 years, and it's much rarer. But this guy was running Dianetics classes out of his house, and his own daughter turned him in because he dared to ask her if she had happened to watch the Nightline episode with Jenna Miscavige Hill in it. And just because he asked her about it, she wrote up a knowledge report, turned him in. He was interrogated. He admitted to watching the episode. They canceled his certifications so that he could no longer make a living. His wife kicked him out of the house. So he was 75 years old. He'd been divorced. He'd lost his house. He'd lost his kids, and he lost any way of making a living. This is what happens in Scientology because of this incredibly heavy indoctrination and snitching culture.
There's a quote I was trying to find. I had it somewhere and then I couldn't find it, but maybe you'll remember what I'm talking about through just a reference. That seemed also relevant. It's a quote from Hubbard when he talks about something, and I didn't see, maybe I was just looking through too quickly, an elaboration on that particular term, but he was talking about the bank agreement, which, as far as I could understand, he's talking about like the reality out there, the social realities of our world, the governments and the institutions and whatnot, as a false reality that I guess tries to enslave you into their ways of thinking, and Scientology is like the way out. Does that ring a bell? Does that make sense?
I know that he used bank in another way, not just the sort of financial bank.
Oh, yeah, I actually just found it. Let me. So this is connected to this KSW thing, which should also, maybe it's worth just listing these. I have the 10 sort of commandments here.
Right.
Having the correct technology, knowing the technology, knowing it is correct, teaching correctly the correct technology, applying the technology, seeing that the technology is correctly applied, hammering out of existence incorrect technology, knocking out incorrect applications, closing the door or incorrect technology, and closing the door or on incorrect application. So this is just like driving home the kind of fundamentalism of the approach. You should do it by the T, right?
That's right. And they will say, if there's a disagreement, they will say, show me the issue, meaning show me the thing Hubbard wrote that we need to go by, because everything has to be done to the letter as to how just today, Jeffrey Augustine has a piece on the bunker for us about the history of the Freewinds. And this was a ship they bought in the 80s. And only after they bought it, they discovered it had a terrible asbestos problem. Jeffrey was quoting this affidavit from somebody who worked on the ship and said the problem they had when they're trying to figure out how to make this ship less dangerous was they could not find anywhere where L. Ron Hubbard had ever used the word asbestos. So they were in a big problem because they knew it was deadly. But if Hubbard never talked about it, then there's no reality for them about how to deal with it. So, I mean, this is how fundamentalist they are, that it's hard for them to deal with anything if Hubbard has not already explained to them what to do.
Yeah, and he goes again to lengths to kind of hammer it in that you have to be tough. This is a tough world, and you don't whine. You do the steps, do this KSW thing. So here's this thing about the bank that I wanted to just have your thoughts on that.
What's it a part of?
So it's from the same series. It's a conversation you had with Claire on Keep Scientology Working, and she says, this is another frequently repeated section of KSW in Scientology. And then there's a quote from Hubbard, I assume. Goes, the bank agreement has made Earth a hell, and if you were looking for hell and found Earth, you would certainly serve. War, famine, agony, and disease has been the lot of man. Right now, the great governments of Earth have developed the means of frying every man, woman, and child on the planet. That is bank. That is the result of, all in caps, collective thought agreement.
Right. What he means by bank, remember the other thing to keep in mind about Scientology emerged at the time when the idea of computers were taking hold, early computers. And so magazines at that time in 1950, 51 were filled with these stories about, wow, computers are going to be able to do this and that, because computers where technology was very primitive at that time. Hubbard seized on that, not knowing what the hell he was talking about, and put a lot of early ideas about computers in Dianetics. In fact, I've had some people look at it and they say basically he had a Reader's Digest understanding of computers. He didn't really know what he was talking about. But one of the things that intrigued him was the idea of a data bank, that memory bank, and that
I see.
That's what he's talking about there, is that not just that you have a memory bank and I have a memory bank, but that there's this memory bank of agreement that we all agree to. And if you look at especially his lectures, he talks about this a lot in his lectures, that even physical laws are things we have agreed upon. They don't have a reality outside of our agreement. And the example he uses is this planet he called Arslycus, where there's this gigantic city and all these millions of workers, and one day one of the workers decides that gravity doesn't exist or something. I can't remember exactly how it goes. But the point is the entire city collapses because everyone stops believing in gravity. And what he's telling his audience is, this is what's holding you back in life, is that we've all agreed to these laws of nature that we think can't be changed, but actually they're just agreed upon. And it's all, like you said, it's all in there. War, famine, man's mistreatment of man, I mean, it's all part of this data bank, memory bank that we all buy into. And he holds out the idea that you can just erase it all through his processes. It has to be through Hubbard, has to be by the letter, but Scientology holds out this basically superhuman process of becoming so powerful that you can deny the laws of physics themselves, because they're just matters of agreement. They don't really exist. So he's got one lecture where he actually talks about that once you get to the OT levels and you unleash those powers, you will be able to crush a planet between your thumb and forefinger.
Mm-hmm.
This is what he is holding out to his listeners. And if you listen to the lecture, it's great because he's saying it in a way where everyone in the room was like, well, of course we're going to be able to do that. No big deal. And of course so they spend $2 million getting to OT8, and they can't, they don't have any superpowers whatsoever, but they believe that this is what Hubbard is leading them to. And I think it's actually very characteristic of the entire New Age movement that kind of grew out of that moment, that post World War II moment where, the atom bomb had really, it's just a terrifying idea. The idea that we're literally using the fires of creation to destroy mankind with a bomb, it really threw people for a loop. And, John Campbell and Hubbard and these others all really believed that the only way mankind was going to survive that horrible idea of atomic annihilation was to literally evolve the human mind to the point where it had mastery over physical laws. Well, I'm sorry, 60 years later, we're still basically primates that, can't jump any higher or run any faster than people before us. But, they really believe this idea that the laws of physics are simply there because we agree that they're there, and we could use mind power to overcome them. That's what he sells. That's what these people spend decades of their lives chasing, is to disagree with that bank agreement and produce a new world. I mean, in some parts of it, it's they put some pretty language on how it's a world without war, but really it's about personal power. These people want to have power over other people. They want to be superhuman. They think this is the real secret. They already think they're superhuman. They already think that they have lived as Jesus Christ in a previous life. They don't like the fact that nobody recognizes how powerful and amazing they are, and Scientology is going to help them get there. So in that way, Scientology is incredibly narcissistic, and it just feeds people's sort of fantasies about who they are in a way that ultimately becomes very destructive.
Yeah, that's some heavy stuff. I mean, some of it appeals to me, like this kind of like Matrix scenario. We live in a collective illusion, and and there's a Neo. You can become Neo and
exactly.
Control. As a story, that's good. As a
well, and this is also why it's so hard. This is also why they're so good at defending. Sometimes the press gets so nasty and they're held up to such ridicule. You wonder how can they maintain their involvement. But think about the Matrix. They definitely think it's like that we live on a prison planet, right, but that all of us can't see it. Right, we're really hooked up to the electrical machine like Neo was, but we're imagining this, a world that we're in. The reality is terrible, and only the Scientologists know it. So, it's like the movie. If you walked up to Neo and said, "Look, everything's fine. Why are you worried about anything?" He would look at you like you're crazy, and then you would say, "No, you're in a cult. You're an idiot." What would Neo do? They put themselves in that place that the person ridiculing you for being a Scientologist cannot understand that they are a prisoner on a grim prison planet, and you are the only one with the truth. That's an incredibly powerful idea. Think about how many movies are based on that idea, right? That the protagonist is the only one who knows what's really going on, and people are trying to convince him that it's he's not really seeing aliens, or you're not really seeing the mob, or you're not really being targeted. And the movie relies on the fact that the protagonist sticks by his guns, doesn't listen to the criticism, and wins out in the end. Every Scientologist thinks that way. That when somebody yells at them and says, you know, this whole Xenu thing is ridiculous, why would you belong to that group? They just think, you know what, because we have the answers and you don't know what you're talking about. And Paul Haggis talked about that in Going Clear, that the criticism actually reinforces your beliefs of being part of this persecuted group, because you know only Scientology is true. Only L. Ron Hubbard figured out how the world really worked. And, you know, it's just, you try to show these people, L. Ron Hubbard was a crackpot. You know, he was just a mediocre science fiction writer. Why? How could this guy really be the one to figure out all the universe's secrets? It's amazing.
Yeah. The reason that quote jumped at me is, like, reading it, I almost felt like I'm reading, I don't know, the internet, you know, people talking about politics today. There's like a lot of conspiratorial thinking today, and the same, like on all sides of the sort of political discourse, it could be that you're not seeing your own privilege or how patriarchy, enslaves you, or on the other side, you're not seeing the deep state and the forces of globalism that Trump or whoever is trying to, or all the way to, you know, lizard people controlling the world and all that. But it seems that kind of thing, not to the extent of physical laws, is a matter of agreement. But this idea that the world outside, the narrative that everybody subscribes to, is false and your group has it correctly, that's pretty prevalent today.
Oh, and the accusation is just, I see it every day. I see conservative people saying that the Democratic Party and liberals are in a cult. I see people on the left saying that Trump followers are in a cult. And, you know, I find it's frustrating because, first of all, I think the word cult is so undefined that it's pretty much useless. And look, we're human beings. I think a certain way, and it blows my mind that somebody I know that I like as a friend of mine has a completely different point of view on it. It's always shocking when you experience that. It doesn't mean that your friend's in a cult. It just means that for whatever reasons, for their upbringing, for what they've studied in their lives, like what they've been exposed to, they see things in a different way. Now, you know, it's true. There are toxic ideas out there on all parts of the political spectrum, and it's important to keep that in mind. But, you know, this right now, I think what's really, I don't want to get too much into politics, man, but what's very frustrating is, and the internet exacerbates this, is that we're just not having a conversation. We're just, you know, in the United States in particular, two sides that are talking at each other, and there's just no conversation. There's no agreement on facts at all. And it's really depressing. I've seen long-time friendships ending. I've seen, you know, it's a very toxic environment in our country right now. And I've been actually kind of receding from it to a certain extent. I have work that I do. I have things that I'm interested in, and it's just too exhausting to look at people ripping themselves to shreds every day online, on television, and it's been a very difficult year, I think, for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, I guess I'm gonna suggest that we stop here. I have a whole other segment here that I would like to get into, the 8 dynamics and the tones of, I don't know exactly how to describe that. There's interesting things in how Scientology deals with communication, more acronyms, more rules.
Well, look, I don't pretend to be an expert on the technology. You've asked me questions about technology. What I'm very fortunate at the website that I got to do that series with experts like Claire Headley, like Bruce Hines, and Jefferson Hawkins, and they're the real experts. And Sonny Pereira has been helping me out a lot lately with stories that involve the technology. We've been taking a close look at some of Hubbard's lectures in the last year that I think have not been talked about very much. And those people are the real experts. And you know, I would just say watch the website. We've got more stuff coming up along those lines. Or, you know, drop me a message. I'll be happy to, if anybody's interested in particular technology we look at, I'd be happy to point to things that we've dealt with, because it's complex. And I mean, you know, some people would say, what, you know, is it worth it? I mean, why are we trying to dissect particulars of processes if we don't really think that they're based on anything scientific at all? And I think partly it's just curiosity. I mean, these people dedicate decades of their lives to it. It is interesting, I think, to find out exactly how these processes work.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's maybe more important to look at the bigger picture about how people are being abused and extorted and silenced. And just the other day, if I got another minute, just the other day, I ran into a couple of people that I was trying to convince to take a. We have some new videos we've been putting up, and I asked them to. They want, you know, to take a look at them, and they were just like, well, who cares about Scientology? South Park showed that they're ridiculous, you know, 15 years ago, 13 years ago. And I just like, yeah, well, South Park was 13 years ago, but in those 13 years, they still have tax exempt status. They're still harming people. So, you know, not everybody's that interested. Not everybody cares about what the inner workings of Scientology. But I think if enough people do, that it's still why it's such a popular subject online. But I wish more people cared, because they're still getting away with things for the large part because just not enough people care about the fact that they're harming people, taking people's money, ripping families apart. So keep an eye on the website. We keep up on it on a daily basis, TonyOrtega.org, and there should be something there that interests you at least every once in a while.
I'm going to just add one more time. I've said that numerous times in this conversation, but it seems important to me that I think one of the values of looking into this story, even in, you know, this great detail that you do, is that it's like an extreme case of something that you do notice in other parts of life and organizations, movements, ideologies, groupthink, all of that. And so I think it helps you notice these patterns outside of such a weird case as Scientology. And maybe, you know, you will be more cautious when there's somebody that is eager to help you explain what the world is and how to solve every problem in your life, and who's the suppressive person in your life, and what exact practices you need to pay for to get better at life.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think you're exactly right on that. And that is a great way to look at why this is an important subject. It does connect to a lot of other groups and a lot of other movements and how they think. They all tend to use the same techniques. Yeah. And it is good to learn from this one. So can I just quickly point out, I still got Unbreakable Miss Lovely on sale. And on November 1st, Paulette Cooper and I have Battlefield Scientology coming out, which is kind of a best of the underground bunker with some of our most important stories going back several years. And Paulette's got introductions to each of the sections, so I think people will enjoy it.
Nice. Looking forward to that. I think there's also the Unbreakable Miss Lovely audio version on Audible.
That's right. That's an Audible version of that, yeah.
And did you narrate it yourself?
I narrated that myself, yeah.
That's the way to do it. I'm very happy when I see people taking that approach. And I hope I don't mess up the link. If I do, I guess I'll change it in editing. But I think if you go to audible.com/MOLTV, which stands for Meaning of Life, the site that we are on now, you can download one book for free. So if people are interested in the story, they can go there and get the Unbreakable Miss Lovely.
Great.
All right. Thanks, man. That was, I really enjoyed these conversations.
Right on, man.
Okay. Talk to you later. Hopefully.